She had been prepared for revenge. A young German woman, barely 23, sat hunched on a metal cot in what had once been a Wehrmacht barracks, now repurposed as an Allied prisoner of war camp. Her grey uniform hung loose on her diminished frame, the red cross on her armband, now a bitter reminder of duties she could no longer perform. The walls around her bore fresh coats of whitewash, but she could still smell the lingering odor of fear and desperation that no amount of paint could mask. Outside the window, she watched American soldiers directing other prisoners toward what appeared to be a mess hall. Their voices carried no malice, no gloating triumph. Instead, there was something almost businesslike about their manner, as though processing captured enemies were simply another administrative task. She pressed her face closer to the glass, trying to understand what she was seeing. 3 days earlier, she had been Greta Hoffmann, auxiliary nurse with the 15th Panzer Division, retreating through the bombed-out ruins of what had once been a thriving Bavarian town. The collapse had come so quickly that surrender felt less like a choice than an inevitability. One moment she was bandaging the shattered leg of a 17-year-old boy who kept calling for his mother. The next, American tanks were rolling down streets where children had once played hopscotch. She had expected execution, or worse. The propaganda had been clear about what happened to German women who fell into enemy hands. Goebbels himself had painted vivid pictures of the fate awaiting those captured by the Bolsheviks, and while these were Americans, the message had been consistent: better to die fighting than to endure the humiliation that would surely follow. She had seen the pamphlets distributed to civilians, the warnings about what Allied soldiers would do to German women. The images were graphic, designed to inspire terror and fanatical resistance. Yet here she sat, 3 days later, with her wounds cleaned and bandaged, wearing clothes that had been laundered, in a room that was heated. The cognitive dissonance was almost overwhelming. The door opened with a soft creak, and an American sergeant entered. He was younger than she had expected, with kind eyes and a slight hesitation in his movements that suggested uncertainty rather than cruelty. In his hands he carried a metal tray. "Guten Morgen," he said, his German heavily accented but earnest. "Good morning." She stared at the tray as he set it on the small table beside her cot. A glass of milk, so white it seemed to glow in the morning light. A thick slice of bread, dark and substantial. And there, impossible but undeniable, a small square of butter, yellow as summer sunshine. Her hands shook as she reached for the glass. When had she last tasted fresh milk? Not the watered-down substitute they had been given in the final months. Not the bitter ersatz coffee made from acorns and chicory, but real milk, rich and creamy. She lifted it to her lips with the reverence one might reserve for communion wine. The taste exploded across her tongue like a memory made manifest. Sweet, clean, with that faint barnyard richness that spoke of actual cows in actual fields. She closed her eyes, and for a moment she was 8 years old again, standing in her grandmother's kitchen in Bavaria, stealing sips from the milk pail, while the old woman pretended not to notice. When she opened her eyes, the American sergeant was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. Not pity, exactly. Not satisfaction. Something closer to recognition, as though he understood the weight of that single sip. "Danke," she whispered. "Thank you." He nodded and left without another word. Around her, other women were experiencing similar moments of disorientation. Across the aisle, Ingrid Müller, who had served as a radio operator with Army Group Center, sat staring at her own breakfast tray, as though it might be booby-trapped. The bread alone was more than she had eaten in a single meal for months. During the retreat, their rations had dwindled to whatever they could scrounge from abandoned farmhouses: moldy potatoes, turnip soup so thin it was essentially flavored water, occasionally a precious can of sardines shared among 6 people. The butter was what truly broke her. She spread it on the bread with fingers that trembled, watching as it melted slightly from the warmth. Real butter. Not the rancid margarine made from coal tar and chemicals that had become standard fare. Not the lard scraped from empty tins, but honest-to-God butter that must have come from well-fed cows in unblasted pastures. The first bite was revelation. The bread was substantial, baked with real wheat flour instead of the sawdust and bark mixture that had passed for bread in the final year of the war. The butter was sweet and fresh, with that particular richness that could only come from cream. Together they created a symphony of flavors that spoke of a world where abundance was still possible. She found herself crying, and the tears surprised her. Not tears of sadness or despair, but something more complex. Relief certainly, gratitude, but also a kind of grief for all the time lost, all the hunger endured, all the lies they had been told about what waited for them if they fell into enemy hands. The propaganda machine had been relentless in its descriptions of Allied brutality. She had seen the films, heard the radio broadcasts, read the leaflets. American soldiers were portrayed as savage barbarians who delighted in the suffering of their enemies. Soviet troops were described as subhuman monsters bent on rape and murder. The British were depicted as cold, calculating imperialists who would grind German culture into dust. Yet here she sat, eating butter. The cognitive dissonance was almost unbearable. If this was wrong, what else might be wrong? If the enemy was capable of such basic human kindness, what did that say about everything she had believed, everything she had been told, everything she had fought for? These questions would haunt her in the days to come, but for now, she focused on the simple miracle of the meal before her. Each bite was a small act of rebellion against the narrative that had shaped her understanding of the world. Each sip of milk was proof that reality could be more complex, more nuanced, more humane than the black and white certainties of wartime propaganda. The mess hall, when she finally ventured there later that morning, was another revelation. Long wooden tables filled with women like herself, all wearing the same expression of stunned disbelief. The American cooks, she noticed, were serving the same food they gave to their own people. No separate, inferior meals for the prisoners, no deliberate cruelty or degradation, just institutional cafeteria food, but more abundant and nutritious than anything most of them had seen in years. She found herself sitting next to a woman who introduced herself as Elizabeth Kramer, formerly a nurse with the 6th Army. Elizabeth had been captured during the chaotic retreat from the Eastern Front, and her stories of the journey west were harrowing. Frozen bodies left by roadsides, children separated from their parents, entire units dissolving into scattered bands of desperate individuals. "I thought they would starve us," Elizabeth whispered, stirring her coffee, real coffee, not ersatz, with a spoon that rattled against the cup from her trembling. "Or worse." Greta nodded, understanding exactly what she meant by worse. The rumors about Soviet treatment of German women had been particularly horrific, and while these were Americans, not Russians, the propaganda had painted all allies with the same brush of savage brutality. Instead, they had been given not just food, but dignity. The American guards addressed them politely, used their names when they learned them, treated them not as subhuman enemies, but as fellow human beings caught up in the machinery of war. It was disorienting in the extreme. The butter became a daily miracle. Each morning, that small yellow square appeared on her breakfast tray, and each morning she marveled at its existence. In a world that had been defined by scarcity, by rationing, by the constant gnawing presence of hunger, the casual abundance represented by that butter seemed almost obscene. She began to pay attention to other details that spoke of plenty. The guards threw away food, actually discarded bread crusts and leftover vegetables, as though they were of no account. She watched from the window as trucks arrived daily with fresh supplies, not the desperate foraging expeditions she remembered from the final months of the war, but routine deliveries of abundance. The Americans, she realized, were fighting a completely different kind of war. While Germany had stripped its countryside bare to feed its war machine, while its people survived on ersatz everything, and made do with less and less, the Americans seemed to have solved the basic problem of supply. They had enough, more than enough. They could afford to be generous even to their enemies, because generosity cost them nothing. This revelation was perhaps more devastating than any military defeat. It suggested that the war had been lost not just on the battlefield, but in the factories and farms, in the fundamental capacity to sustain a population while waging global conflict. The fortress Europe that Hitler had promised was revealed as hollow, a facade maintained through propaganda, while the reality crumbled beneath the weight of impossible logistics. Her letters home, when she was allowed to write them, struggled to convey these insights without running afoul of the censors. How could she tell her mother that she was eating better as a prisoner than she had as a free citizen of the Reich? How could she explain that the enemy was feeding her fresh milk and butter every morning, while her family survived on turnip soup and hope. Instead, she wrote carefully crafted messages designed to slip past both American and German censorship. Dear Mama, I am well and being treated according to international law. The food here is adequate. I think of you often and hope you are managing with the rations. Please give my love to Papa, and tell him I am being strong as he taught me. What she wanted to write was, Dear Mama, everything we were told was wrong. The Americans are not monsters, they are people like us, with families and hopes and fears. They give me butter every morning. Real butter, Mama, like we used to have before the war. I don't understand how this is possible. I don't understand what we were fighting for anymore. But such truths were too dangerous, too devastating to the carefully constructed narrative that made sense of their suffering. Instead, she kept her revelations to herself and tried to process the implications of abundance in a world defined by scarcity. The other women in the camp were grappling with similar contradictions. Martha Schneider, who had served as a telephone operator with the Afrika Korps before being transferred to Italy, couldn't stop talking about the waste she witnessed. They throw away meat, she whispered to Greta one evening, as they sat in the common area, each nursing a cup of hot chocolate, another impossible luxury. I saw them scraping perfectly good beef into the garbage. At home, we would fight over scraps like that. The waste was almost offensive in its casualness. American soldiers discarded cigarettes after smoking only half, left food on their plates, threw away clothing that would have been treasured by any German family. It spoke of a nation that had never experienced true scarcity, never been forced to choose between heating and eating, never learned to extract nutrition from potato peels and make soup from bones. The psychological impact of this abundance was profound and complicated. On one level, it was a relief beyond measure to go to sleep with a full stomach, to wake up knowing that breakfast would be substantial and nourishing. The physical transformation was remarkable. Within weeks, the gaunt faces of malnourishment began to fill out. The desperate edge of constant hunger faded, color returned to cheeks that had been gray with exhaustion. But the emotional impact was more complex. Each morning's butter was also a small act of humiliation, not because of any cruelty on the part of their captors, but because it revealed the depth of their previous deprivation. It made clear that while they had been told they were sacrificing for the greater good, enduring hardship as patriots, people on the other side of the conflict had been living in relative comfort. The German war effort had demanded everything from its people: their sons for the military, their food for the troops, their metal for weapons, their energy for production. The American war effort, by contrast, seemed to have been conducted as a kind of industrial expansion, increasing production and employment rather than demanding sacrifice from the civilian population. This fundamental difference in approach suggested uncomfortable truths about the nature of their conflict. If America could fight a global war while still providing butter to enemy prisoners, what did that say about German claims of resource scarcity? What did it say about the necessity of all the sacrifices demanded from German families? Some women began to ask dangerous questions. If their enemies were capable of such abundance, such humanity, such adherence to international law regarding prisoners, what did that suggest about the nature of their own leadership? What did it say about the propaganda they had been fed for years? These questions were usually whispered in the darkness of the barracks, never spoken aloud during the day. They were treasonous thoughts, the kind that could have landed them in a concentration camp had they voiced them while the war was still being fought. But now, with the war lost and their world turned upside down, the questions demanded answers. Elizabeth Kramer, the former nurse, put it most succinctly one night as they lay in their cots, listening to the distant sound of American soldiers singing around a campfire. If they can afford to give us butter every morning, she whispered, what else could they afford? What else did they choose not to do to us? The implication hung in the air like a challenge to everything they had believed. If the Americans were capable of casual kindness, if they could afford to be generous even to their enemies, then the total war mentality that had consumed Germany seemed not just brutal, but unnecessary. The zero-sum thinking that had justified every atrocity, every sacrifice, every compromise of conscience was revealed as false. The letters that did make it back to Germany, heavily censored but still carrying fragments of these revelations, created their own kind of havoc. Families receiving word that their daughters and wives were being well fed in Allied camps struggled to reconcile this information with the reports of bombing raids, food shortages, and general desperation at home. Some recipients dismissed the letters as propaganda, convinced that their loved ones were being forced to write positive reports about their treatment. Others wondered if the women had been brainwashed or coerced, but a few began to ask the same dangerous questions that were plaguing the prisoners themselves. If the enemy could afford to be kind, why had their own government demanded such brutal sacrifice? These questions would only multiply as more prisoners were repatriated and began to tell their stories. The contrast between what they had experienced in Allied hands and what they had been told to expect created a kind of cultural cognitive dissonance that would take years to resolve. For Greta, sitting in her heated barracks with her stomach full of real food, the future seemed both promising and terrifying. The promise was obvious: she would survive, she would eventually go home, she would rebuild her life in whatever Germany emerged from the ashes of defeat. But the terror was more subtle, more existential. How do you go home when home was built on lies? How do you face your family when you've learned that everything you suffered was unnecessary? How do you explain that the enemy treated you better than your own government ever did? The butter would continue to appear each morning, that small yellow miracle that spoke of abundance in a world of scarcity, of humanity in a time of dehumanization, of truth in an age of propaganda. And each morning, it would continue to ask its silent questions about the nature of power, the cost of war, and the price of believing in beautiful lies. Days turned to weeks, and the routine of plenty became almost normal. The initial shock of abundance gave way to a kind of guilty adaptation. She found herself looking forward to meals, appreciating the variety in a way that would have seemed sinful during the war years. Fresh vegetables appeared with startling regularity, carrots that were actually orange, potatoes without eyes or rot, onions that made her cry not from hunger, but from their sharpness. The American efficiency was staggering. Supply trucks arrived like clockwork, unloading crates of food that would have fed her entire hometown for weeks. She watched from the window as cases of canned goods, sacks of flour, and impossibly, refrigerated trucks carrying fresh meat and dairy products were wheeled into the camp kitchens. It was Martha who first voiced what many of them were thinking: "They're feeding us better than we fed ourselves before the war." The statement hung in the air, uncomfortable in its truth. Before 1939, even in peacetime, many German families had struggled with rationing and shortages. The economic chaos of the Weimar Republic had meant that luxuries like butter and fresh milk were reserved for special occasions. Yet here, as prisoners of war, they were receiving such items daily. The psychological adjustment was complex and painful. Gratitude warred with humiliation, relief fought with anger, hope battled with despair. How do you process the kindness of your enemy when you've been taught that such kindness is weakness, that mercy is a luxury that strong nations cannot afford? Some women retreated into denial, insisting that the good treatment was temporary, a facade that would crumble once the Americans grew tired of their propaganda show. Others embraced the kindness so completely that they began to express genuine affection for their captors, a response that disturbed their fellow prisoners almost as much as overt cruelty would have. But for most, like Greta, the experience settled into a kind of uncomfortable equilibrium. They accepted the food, the warmth, the basic human dignity they were offered, while struggling to understand what it meant for their understanding of the world. The butter, in particular, became a symbol that transcended its nutritional value. It represented everything they had been denied, everything they had been told was impossible, everything that distinguished mere survival from actual living. In a war that had reduced existence to its most basic elements: find food, stay warm, avoid death. The daily appearance of that small yellow square suggested that there were other ways to organize human society. The American guards, she began to notice, treated their work as routine rather than righteous. They weren't cruel, but neither were they particularly ideological. They fed the prisoners, maintained order, processed paperwork, and counted down the days until they could go home, just like any other group of young men far from their families and eager for the war to end. This ordinariness was perhaps more disturbing than either cruelty or excessive kindness would have been. It suggested that the capacity for basic human decency was not a sign of weakness or special virtue, but simply a choice. The Americans had chosen to treat their prisoners humanely not because they were particularly noble, but because they could afford to do so, and because their system of laws and values required it. The contrast with German treatment of prisoners was stark and undeniable. She had heard the stories, whispered accounts of Soviet POWs starved to death in Wehrmacht camps, of forced laborers worked beyond the point of exhaustion, of undesirable populations simply eliminated to save resources. These atrocities had been justified by necessity, by the demands of total war, by the supposed life or death struggle for German survival. But if the Americans could fight the same war while still providing butter to enemy prisoners, what did that say about the supposed necessity of German brutality? Were the atrocities truly unavoidable, or were they choices made by leaders who preferred cruelty to the harder work of maintaining both warfare and humanity? These questions had no comfortable answers, and they would follow the women long after their repatriation. But for now, in the warm barracks with their stomachs full and their wounds healing, they could only grapple with the immediate reality of unexpected kindness in a world that had forgotten how to be kind. The letters home became exercises in careful translation, attempts to convey complex truths through simple words that could pass the censors. Dear Heinrich, I am eating well here. The Americans follow their laws about prisoners. I think often of our talks about honor and duty. I hope you are finding enough to eat at home. Your loving wife Ingrid. What she meant was, dear Heinrich, everything we believed about honor was wrong. True honor would have been feeding our own people instead of building more tanks. True duty would have been protecting our families instead of conquering our neighbors. The Americans show more honor in their treatment of enemies than we showed in our treatment of friends. But such truths were too dangerous to write, too devastating to contemplate fully. Instead, they existed in the spaces between words, in the careful silences that suggested more than they revealed. The repatriation, when it finally came, would be another kind of shock. Returning to a Germany of rubble and hunger, where butter was still a distant memory and fresh milk remained a luxury, would force these women to confront the full implications of what they had experienced. They would find themselves in the strange position of missing their captivity, of remembering their time as prisoners as a period of plenty in lives otherwise defined by scarcity. Some would never speak of their experiences, finding the contradictions too painful to share. Others would become advocates for the kind of society that could afford to be generous even to its enemies, though such advocacy would be dangerous in the politically charged atmosphere of post-war Germany. But all of them would remember the butter, that small daily miracle that spoke of possibilities they had never imagined, of choices they had never known existed, of a world where abundance could coexist with mercy, where strength could manifest as kindness rather than cruelty. In the end, perhaps that was the most subversive gift their captors gave them, not just the physical sustenance that restored their bodies, but the intellectual nourishment that forced them to question everything they had taken for granted about power, about war, about the supposed necessity of suffering in service to abstract ideals. The butter would melt on their tongues each morning, but its implications would linger for the rest of their lives, a sweet reminder that the world contained more possibilities for human kindness than they had ever been taught to imagine. And in a century that would be defined by such possibilities and such failures of imagination, that lesson would prove to be worth more than all the military victories and defeats that had brought them to that moment of unexpected grace. Years later, when the immediate trauma of war had faded, and they could speak more freely about their experiences, many of these women would describe their time as prisoners of war as a kind of accidental education in the possibilities of human society. They had seen in microcosm what a government could accomplish when it chose to prioritize human welfare over abstract ideology, when it decided that even enemies deserved basic dignity. The butter had been more than food, it had been a lesson in political philosophy, served up on a breakfast tray by young American soldiers, who probably never realized they were teaching their prisoners about democracy, simply by following their own laws and values. And that perhaps was the most powerful lesson of all, that true strength didn't require cruelty, that real victory could include mercy, and that the highest achievement of any civilization might be its willingness to remain human even in the face of inhumane circumstances. The small yellow square on the breakfast tray had contained all of these truths, waiting to be discovered by women who had been taught to expect only harshness from their enemies, and had found instead an abundance they had never known was possible.